Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Engagers, so welcome to another episode of the Professor Game Podcast. And today we have David. But David, are you prepared to engage?
Absolutely.
David was born in Britain, raised in South Africa, and is now a resident in the Netherlands. So everywhere and nowhere is home. He's also a published author, poet, musician, and artist. He's also been involved in an entrepreneur for over 25 years, and he thinks that the link that joins everything in his life together is creativity. So very important for us creating and designing games, gamification, game-based learning, and all related things. And by sharing what he knows about his human capacity, he aims to improve the world one presentation at a time. He has been on stage in one capacity or another since, get this, 1980. He's bringing experience, research, humor, and passionate energy to every presentation. There's many more things we could talk about, but we are going to get into them along the interview because, of course, he is forever curious. He's asking why, he's asking how. So let's do this in the interview. So is there anything we missed, David, that you think should be mentioned before we kick off?
Well, there's, of course, one more thing, which is that I'm also the co-founder of the Playful Creative Summit, which is an annual online summit dedicated to the subjects of play and games and, of course, creativity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That actually makes a lot of sense. That is happening as early next year in 2021, right?
That's correct. 21st of April, 2021, it kicks off.
That makes a lot of sense. That sounds very, very interesting. We'll probably be getting into that during the interview. Along to the end, we'll see where the interview takes us. So, David, first thing, what is it like a regular day, a regular week? What does your life look like? We want to know what is being David look like today.
Well, oddly enough, with the whole global pandemic and lockdown and all of that stuff, my life hasn't changed very much at all. I'm very much an early morning kind of a person. So I get up when it's still dark because I don't get interrupted then, and I can have a lot of peace and quiet to do my thinking. So I tend to spend my mornings writing, developing things like training programs, writing blogs. I'm currently working on a book. Anything that requires dedicated creative thinking and the exercise of some kind of a skill, generally like writing. Because I get up so early, that means that more or less by about 2-3 o'clock, I'm pretty useless when it comes to intellectual power. So that's when I do slightly more social kinds of things, like having meetings or doing household tasks and that kind of stuff. I also have 2 small kids, so there's a lot of running around in the morning and in the evening. And so by the time the sun goes down and the kids have gone to bed, I like to read, maybe watch a series or what have you. But as you can imagine, there's not much else other than that happening right now, thanks to the current global situation.
Many things have changed. That's the topic of a conference that I recently attended to, the Gamification Europe conference, where we were talking about all these things. And the theme of the conference this year was literally the word disruption. So yeah, I think it's not just that topic of that conference, but maybe of 2020, I'd say.
Well, it's interesting. I think the word disruption is often misused quite selectively. And I think when you start talking about what's happening in the world right now, yes, that is true disruption. Normally people are talking about Airbnb and Uber, which are basically just giving middle-class people more ways to spend their money. That's not really disruptive.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. I guess there could be many, many different arguments and sort of chats around what are these innovative startups doing and how they've changed or not changed the way the people are, as you said, spending their well and hard-earned money. But David, we'd like to get into a question which is, to be honest, it's been one of the most important questions in this podcast because it's brought us so many insights, so much about our very, very interesting guests. And we'd like to know about a time when you set out to do something, and something creative, something playful, And of course, as many times it happens, it didn't go your way. So things went down. It was a failure, or it was a fail of first attempt in learning. So we want to be there with you. We want to learn from that lesson. We want to know how you got out of it. What did you take from that? What would you do different in the future? So again, tell us through that story. We want to live it with you.
Well, I think, as basically a professional creative, every day involves some kind of a failure. And I think that's one of the beauties of having a creative mindset, is that those individual so-called failures just don't really feel like that. I think possibly the biggest particular failure was when I was still in high school. I decided that instead of finding a good one-act play in order to enter into the local high school competition, I was going to write one. Because last year I'd won using someone else's play, and I was like, well, I know how to do this now. And we came stone last. I think what I took out of that is that you just don't know enough from one iteration ever, and that you will always discover more things when you revisit old projects. And quite often you'll discover that actually there was some really good stuff there. But maybe, in my case, in this particular example, my skills weren't up to it, quite frankly. And quite possibly my ideas were more ambitious than my ability to deliver. But that's with the perspective of 30 or so years. At the time, it knocked me pretty hard. It didn't stop me from writing, but I did kind of think, well, maybe theatre isn't the ultimate expression of what I want to be doing. And I moved onto short stories and to poetry, which has proved to be a lot more successful for me. Interesting.
Is there, again, when you mentioned one of the things was that saying, just one iteration is not necessarily enough. Is there something that you would have approached differently? I know this is sort of in the further past at this point, but taking from that, is there a lesson or something that you would do differently? Like you had a similar thing going on today. What would you approach in a different way? Well,
I think the biggest lesson I've learned most recently is that it's better not to work totally solo in isolation. In the gaming world, of course, I doubt that ever happens. You kind of require a team to be able to put a modern digital game together. But the notion of writing a script for a play is one of those kind of romantic high art notions that you lock yourself up in the tower and only eat bread and drink water until it's finished, and then it's magically wonderful. And I think when I was 17, I might have believed that a little bit too much, and I didn't ask anybody to read it or to give me any feedback. So it ended up being very self-indulgent. So if I were to attempt that again, the first thing I would do is present someone with a draft for feedback, and then think about that feedback, take on board whatever I perceived to be valid and useful, and go again, until it was better.
Absolutely. So the iterations, the getting early feedback is something that is definitely a very, very important topic in these lands of, again, designing, playful, being creative, creating games, and all these things. So thank you for that story. I think it was very, very interesting. And again, when we get very personal about these things, it shows that these things are not only authentic, but also that they make sense in the real world. It's not just about having these beautiful theories. And don't get me wrong, I work all around. I work at a university, so I'm surrounded by fantastic academics and researchers who are doing a great job figuring out some of the biggest questions in the world, and in the business world, especially where I'm at. But sometimes it's also interesting and nice to see that firsthand experience. It doesn't mean it's, statistically relevant, but it does make sense for many of us from a personal perspective. So thank you for that story, David. And of course, we don't just want to talk about those difficult moments. We also like to talk about, success. So is there any story again about creating something playful? It was difficult or not, but it ended up being a success, something that you can sort of have that proud moment about. We want to be there and sort of live that moment with you, but also, get one or two things that you'd say you could attribute part of that success to.
Well, yeah. I as a bit of a game, actually, just as a bit of messing around and playing about, I started publishing some of the poetry I was writing on Facebook back in about 2009, 2010. It was literally, I've been writing poetry my whole life, but most people didn't realize I was a poet. And I was like, social media poetry, why not? We'll give it a go. And I put a couple of poems up, and I really wasn't taking it seriously. I had no end goal in mind. It was quite a, I mean, it was poetry, so it was serious stuff, but it was also done in quite a playful way. And I was just blown away by the reactions I was getting. Not that everyone was telling me that my poetry was wonderful, but people were reading a poem which I thought was, quite light maybe and a little bit silly. And they were like going, wow, well, that's such a powerful insight, and it resonated so much as happened in my life. And then the one day I put up a poem and I was like, this is the best thing I've written in ages. It was fantastic. I was really pleased. And no one reacted. There were no likes and there were no comments. And then a couple of days later, I put up a piece where I was like, not sure about this one. And everyone was going mad. They were like, wow, that's so good. And I was, in the middle of this kind of non-committal mucking around with social media, I learned something quite profound and important, which was that my opinion of the relative quality of what I was writing could not be trusted. And so what I did was I said, okay, I'm going to publish a poem every single day. And I did. Every single workday for 18 months, I published a poem on Facebook. And at the end of that, I selected about 110 of those and sent them off to an actual literary editor who whittled it down to 90. And I published a book. And I only selected the poems that were the ones that the people on Facebook said that they liked. So what started out as a bit of a game, a bit of fun with my poetry, turned into an actual fully fledged published paperback book with an accompanying ebook, and at one stage a CD where musicians I knew took some of the poems and turned them into songs and recorded them in their home studios. So, I mean, that was an unexpected win.
Absolutely. And again, I mean, for me, there's many things that we could take from that. There are sort of many roads we could get into from there. But what is, one of those things that you say, this was maybe unexpected, maybe it was expected, I don't know. One of those things that you would say, well, this is sort of part of my success could come because of this. Like, what would be sort of your message after living through something like this?
If you don't show up, if you don't start, nothing's going to happen. And if you do start, almost anything can happen. And that was the thing for me. I was like, wow, look at that. All of a sudden, I'm a published poet. That would never have happened if I hadn't just had the guts the one day to go, you know what, I'm going to share this stuff. Even though nobody thinks I'm a poet or knows I'm a poet, I'm going to start sharing this.
Absolutely. Showing up, putting in the work, showing it to other people. I mean, that always is very, very helpful. And I'm sure it could be something something could come out of it, and it could be something fantastic. It could be not much. I mean, that's part of the beauty of it. We don't know what we're getting into until results come in. But if you don't try, you'll never know. I love that. Yeah.
I think sometimes that the skill that people in this world need to learn the most is not how to do things well or properly. It's how to start doing things. We all seem a bit scared about that.
Yeah. Start and do it. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, David, we've been talking about the creative process. We've been talking about playfulness. When you approach a project in which you need to use these skills, is there any, process, thought process, way of approaching things, or just, brainstorming, however you want to call it? How do you do when you approach one of these projects? Again, it could be your process, or we could call it another way. How do you approach these things?
I think for me, I'm not really a high detail kind of person. I'm very much a big picture kind of guy. So I tend to go big straight up. I don't start thinking about characters or themes or the mechanics of how the thing's going to work. I tend to want to rather think about the end product. What is this thing going to be? What is it going to do? How do I want it to look? And once I've got that idea pretty well sketched out, then I will start drilling down into the details, which means that the big idea obviously changes as I go along. But what I've found in my career is that for me anyway, if I don't have an end point in mind, I find it difficult to stay the course, to actually finish the project. So by starting with a really big idea, that kind of defines the end point. And then I find it much easier to go through the process of structuring, building, and splitting it up into parts, because I've got a pretty good idea about where I'm going. So that's pretty much my method with everything. I go big and then go, all right, how do we reverse engineer that?
So go big, look at the big picture, look at the sort of the overall strategy. What is it you want to go for? And then get into the details. And again, sort of dividing this into these two parts sounds fantastic. Is there sort of any tips? We want to go big. How do we go about it? Is there any way for you to come up with ideas? Can you sort of give us a little tip on that one? And then, of course, once you have that idea, what will be sort of the next step? How would you approach that?
Right. Well, I think when you're ideating, when you're trying to come up with a great new idea for something, the first thing you need to be able to do is to switch off your internal critic. You have that monkey mind, which is going, that'll never work. You're an idiot. Come on. So you've got to get into the habit of suspending judgment. And I find one of the easiest ways to do that is to say to yourself, all right, let's pretend that we have got all the money, all the expertise, we've got all the tools, we've got all the equipment, we've got all the people, we've got the team that we need. So in other words, there are no barriers to achieving what we want to achieve here. Now, given that we have all of that, what are we going to do? And then the second technique I like to use is to just ask the question, what if? So what if we could create a 3D interactive game that could be connected to a carbon printer so that people could actually create their character at home? What if? And, just run with it, because what if isn't a serious question. So our interior critic tends to kind of let us get away with all sorts of crazy stuff when we're saying what if. But what happens is then out of that craziness, you start to see these glimmers of gold, which you can then pull out and apply your rational mind to, and then say, okay, well, that's actually a pretty good idea. How can we practically make that happen? And then you just think about the first step. What is the smallest thing I can do right now that puts me on the road towards making that idea a reality? And then what's the next step, and what's the next step? There's a great saying which says, how do you eat an elephant? You cut it into really small pieces. And I tend to approach ideas, ideation, and projects in much the same way.
Interesting. Very, very good tips, I have to say. Very useful way of sort of approaching these things. So thank you very much for that as well.
Cool.
Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification.
And thinking about these things, this process, you've given us many tips, many practical ideas that we've gone through. Is there any sort of, best practice when you're coming up with ideas and you're diving into playfulness? Are there any, again, best practice? I don't like to call these things silver bullets in any way, but...
Yeah. Well, look, I think if you observe your average working day over a period of weeks, you'll probably notice that there is one time of day where you're golden, where things are just going smoothly. You're solving problems. You're coming up with ideas. You're whacking it out. It's all happening. It's kind of like a biorhythmic thing. A lot of people are, there's people who are morning people, there's people who are afternoon people, there's people who are night owls. But apart from that, I'm talking more about this idea of is there a particular time of day where it's easier for you to get into flow? And there is. Pretty much everyone has got it. So the trick is to spend a couple of weeks observing yourself quietly and just make a mental note when you're on song, when things are going really well. And then what you want to do is you want to reserve that time for your creative thinking. You don't want to be starting to come up with really good ideas and revolutionary procedures and great design when you're tired, when you've just woken up and you're groggy, or when you're at the end of the day, or when you're hungry because it's just before lunch. You want to be your best possible self. So, and then you've got to set that time aside, not every now and then, but every day. Because look, creativity is not a skill as such, but like a skill, the more you access it, the more you do it, the easier it goes, the better you get at getting into it. It becomes, it's like muscle memory. The more you practice it, the less you have to think about doing it. And one of the critical things about the creative mind state is that you must not try too hard. So if you've got a regular appointment with yourself at 9 a.m. Monday to Friday to show up and to do some brainstorming and some ideas, or to be sketching, or to be, writing down plans, looking at game flows, or whatever it is that you're doing, you will find that after about a month of doing that, you're able to step into that world so effortlessly, and you'll be able to make so much more progress because the mechanics of it have become automated, allowing your unconscious mind to step to the fore with more surprising combinations and approaches than you would ever be able to come up with if you went into a team brainstorm once every 2 months.
Interesting. So basically making of that which you want to achieve, especially in a creative fashion, making of it a habit, right?
Yeah. And I think the same applies to play, to gaming. If you, it's Pavlov's dog, right? Bell rings, dog drools.
I turn on my PlayStation and know what happens next.
Exactly. And if you do it exactly the same time every day, you're going to be back where you were the day before in a heartbeat.
So times of the day, taking a look at that seems to be very, very important, at least in your experience. And that sounds great. There's people who say morning person, night person. To be honest, I might have to take a look and observe myself a bit more, but I can't say I'm a morning or a night person. I know I don't want to stay too late at night, but it's not like, oh yeah, the morning is the prime time or 9 p.m. is the prime time. I haven't figured that out. Maybe I have to.
Well, maybe that's because your prime time is, somewhere between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m.
Interesting. We'll take a look at that for sure.
Cool.
So David, there's other things that are very important for us. And one of them is guests like you. Very, very important in this podcast. And guests have ideas. They hear these questions and they sometimes imagine this or that person answering to that question. Is there, again, somebody that comes to your mind when you listen to these questions, when you heard the podcast? Oh, I wish they had interviewed this person or whatever. Somebody come to your mind?
Well, as I said to you before we started this whole process, I'm not much of a gamer or a gamification kind of a guy. So for me, I would be really interested in speaking to a neuroscientist by the name of David Eagleman, because he's been doing a lot of research into how the human brain does what it does when it comes up with ideas. I would literally love to pick his brain.
Absolutely. Sounds like an exciting guest. We've had some people that have spoken about the brain and about some of the substances going around in the brain as well. We've had a couple of those guests, very, very interesting, but he sounds like a very interesting person as well, and with a very interesting focus in that sense. And keeping up with the recommendations, would you recommend any book? Maybe, again, from your field of creativity, of playfulness, is there anything that you would recommend us to have, in our bookcase?
Sure. I think there's 2, well, maybe now 3 books that have made a big impact on me in the last couple of years. The first one is Carol Dweck's book about mindset. I think it's just called Mindset, which is all about this idea that we need to have a growth mindset, which has got a lot to do with resilience. It's got a lot to do with overcoming failure. Apropos your earlier question, it's actually such a simple formula, but it just makes such enormous sense. So Mindset, Carol Dweck, absolutely.
That makes a lot of sense. That book, I've heard of it. I haven't read it, but I think, shifting your mindset or putting your mindset in the right place is something that can help us do fantastic things.
Yeah, absolutely. And then more recently, I'm reading a book called How to Do Nothing. And the subtitle is Resisting the Attention Economy, which is all about, as you can imagine, social media and screen time. And this idea that actually our attention is worth money. So why are we giving it away to social media platforms when we should be spending it on ourselves? It's quite a radical book, actually. It's quite revolutionary in terms of like trying to get people to revolt. I'm really enjoying that. It's quite a, I spend all day on the internet. We all do at the moment, don't we? I mean, and then you read this book where they're kind of going, well, all you're doing is subjecting yourself to a algorithm which is narrowing your focus and narrowing your ability to connect with the world around you. It's quite a scary read, but it's also got some really positive and strategies and techniques built into it as well. So that one's definitely worth looking out for. How to Do Nothing.
It sounds absolutely fantastic. And, You were saying that, and I was remembering not only a past guest, but also his most recent book. I don't know if you've heard of Nir Eyal,
Yeah.
of the Hooked model.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now he has his latest book. It's called Indistractable, and it's all about, getting back your attention. And we talked about this in a recent interview as well. Well, recent. It was episode 100, so 50 episodes ago. But I think there is something very interesting coming up, sort of that resistance movement onto all those. Again, it's social media, but it's so many things as well that are calling our attention, and we're losing our focus in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree.
So when talking about these things, we've talked about distraction, but what would you say is actually your superpower? That thing that you do probably better than at least most people, in the world or in your community, whatever you want to go for. Like, what is that thing that makes you in a way special?
I think what I'm doing right now, I'm not going to say I'm a really good public speaker, but I seem to have an ability to articulate concepts and to explain ideas in a way that makes them very much more accessible to a wide range of people than possibly even the person who wrote the idea down in the first place. Verbally, I'm got quite a way with explaining stuff. I don't even know really how it works. And that's why I guess I've dived so deeply into this whole idea of what creativity is and how it works, because I believe that it's at the root of my ability to assimilate information, process it, resynthesize it, and then broadcast that out in a slightly different form. That's I think, if I look at my skill set, that's definitely the thing that I'm like, wow, okay, I think that's the thing I'm the best at.
It makes a lot of sense. That is very, very, very important, because it's not only about being able to do the things, which is super important, but sometimes as well, we need inspiration. We need to understand things to be able to do things, and somebody has to help us understand. And that's what, it's one of my passions, which is all about teaching and helping other people understand. So I have to say that's near to my heart for sure, David.
Yeah, cool.
So, David, is there any final piece of advice you want to leave the engagers with? Remember, this audience of people who are all into creative processes, playfulness, game design, all of these things. Is there any final piece of advice you want to leave us with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, gaming is a huge industry. Gamification is become a real business buzzword, and it's getting mutilated and abused left, right, and center. And I think if you're active in that play space, rule number one's got to be, there are no rules. You should be breaking absolutely every single one of them. Every single game theory, every single design theory, everything that everyone's ever told you that this is the way, you've got to break it. Because if you want to do something new, if you want to do something interesting, you can't just carry on doing what has already been done. And that takes courage and it takes conviction. But for me, it's the way to newness, to new thoughts, and to new processes.
That makes a lot of sense, and thank you very much for that. And I know I don't want to let you go, because the way we got to meet each other, the way we got to get into contact is because of the summit that you were organizing along with your partner. But tell us about it. Like what is it all about? Tell us where we can find more about that before we end this interview. All
right, thank you. Yeah, the summit's simply called the Playful Creative Summit, and you can visit the site for it, playfulcreativesummit.com. At the moment, it still has the information up from the 2020 summit. The second edition will take place from the 21st of April, 2021. And the summit is aimed at anybody who is interested in the topics of play and games and creativity. Our speakers are selected from all around the world, from multidisciplines, but they are all professionals who work with play and creativity every single day. And what they do during their interviews is share their insights, their techniques, some tools and tips in order to help other people to improve their own skill set or to understand these topics better. So it's all online. It's totally free, and it consists of 45 speakers. And it's not live, and we don't run a strict schedule. So once you're registered, you can watch all the videos at your leisure. You don't have to log on at 9 o'clock to catch whoever, Rob Alvarez, or at 2 o'clock to catch somebody else. You can just log on whenever you've got time and select whichever video has gone live for that day that you want to watch. And in fact, what we're also doing now is leaving everything live for the whole weekend after the 3 days of the summit are over, So for those people who have hectic work and family lives, you just aren't able to watch anything, can maybe catch up a bit over the weekend. And it's totally free, which is the big bonus. We do have other tiers with added benefits, of course, that you can purchase. But once that goes live towards the beginning of next year, you'll be able to see that for yourselves.
That sounds amazing. That sounds like a very interesting thing. It's interesting that you chose to go for that format of just having it there available. It's pre-recorded and free as well. I think it's a very interesting way of approaching this. I didn't participate last year. Sounds like something that is worth at least checking out, seeing how it goes, and I would definitely be checking that out myself. So go over there, the playfulcreativesummit.com. Make sure you check it out. Make sure you see what's going on there once the information of 2021 comes up. Do you have any sort of date for that?
Yeah, the site will go live with registrations being possible at the end of February 2021.
Okay, so we do have kind of a date. Maybe we will get back and talk a little bit more about that, what's coming up in the future. But for now, thank you very much for this information. David, is there any other place you want to lead us to? Any call to action? Anywhere we can know more about you?
Well, my website's easy enough to find. It's just my name, davidchislett.com. There you can find out more about my keynotes that I present, as well as read any number of articles and download a couple of my ebooks. The poetry book that I told you about is available there also as a free download. So that's probably the best place to start. Everything else I do, you can find from there.
That sounds fantastic. So thank you once again very much for being with us today, David. Thank you for all those insights, all that experience that you brought together, all that, superpower of letting people understand things better through the special ability that you do have. And thank you very much for all that. So, however, we've been having a good time, but for now, and at least for today, it is time to say that it's game over.
Engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast, and I hope you enjoyed this interview with David. And I'd like to know if you have any future questions for future guests. If you do, please go to professorgame.com/question and ask your question. If it gets selected, and as I've always said, you have pretty good chances, it will come up in a future episode so that you get your answer. And before you go on to your next mission, before you click continue, remember to subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.